In this episode of Ideas, I talk with Cal Newport about his book, Deep Work. And let me just say, this is probably one of the most challenging episodes I've ever done. And I'm not perfect at it by any means. But I try to bring people on the show that will not only challenge you, but me as well. And so we talk about a lot of the distractions that are keeping each and every one of us from our best work. All right, take a listen to this episode, hear what Cal has to say, and be inspired. Here we go. All right, today's guest is Cal Newport. He's an assistant professor of computer science at Georgetown University. He's also the author of So Good They Can't Ignore You and the terrific book he's here to talk about today, Deep Work. Cal, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Adam, happy to do it.
You know, the last interview we scheduled, we had to reschedule because of jackhammering outside your house. And my first question to you is, do you ever feel like the world is conspiring against you to put in deep work?
It can seem that way. And I'll say the jackhammering is not even the worst. Once I was doing live radio and a work crew outside my office decided they needed to drill repeated holes in the drywall.
Oh, wow.
Literally across the whole panel. I don't even know what they were doing. They just drill holes in the wall. But I think the broader question there is interesting, which is the idea that the universe is conspiring against you, I think, picks up a broader reality of our culture right now, which is that there's this persistent entropy away from focused concentration. There's always sort of been. I mean, concentration is a artificial type thing to do in some sense. It's difficult. It requires the marshaling of energy. It's not necessarily a natural state. But certainly in our current times, more than probably any other time in history, there is this persistent entropy that's constantly trying to push us in both our professional and personal lives away from sustained concentration on one target. So it makes it much harder. Though, as I like to say, the entrepreneurial mindset on that is that also makes it much more scarce, which means your value for doing it will be higher.
Well, let's dive in deeper to that idea there that things are pulling us away. What are the biggest things today that are pulling us away from concentration? Let's get specific here.
I think there's two different forces, and it sort of depends if you're talking about your personal or your professional life. And so in obviously our life outside of work, the whole revolution involving smartphones and social media has put sort of more resources, more capital resources than ever before in human history are now being invested in trying to get you distracted. And that's having interesting consequences, especially for younger people. In the workplace, it's actually a more complicated picture. The way I like to think about what's happening in the workplace, which right now I think most knowledge work workplaces adopt workflows that are actively hostile to deep work, make it very difficult. Typically, the most standard workflow, and this can vary over different tools, but the standard workflow you'll see in most knowledge work organizations right now, I call the hyperactive hive mind. And it's based on lots of unstructured, unscheduled messaging back and forth between people. So it's lots of emails or lots of Slack chats and or lots of meetings, just back and forth conversation between different people, and we'll sort of figure things out on the fly. This, of course, makes it very, very difficult to do deep, concentrated thinking. And my growing hypothesis there, I have several explanations for it, but my sort of broader hypothesis surrounding why we're working in that way, even though it's not the most productive, is that knowledge work in the age of digital networks is new, relatively speaking, and complicated. And if you look back at other historical intersections of new technologies and the economy, we see it just takes a while to figure out how should we work with these new tools. So this is my overarching hypothesis now. The way we're working now with, say, email and Slack is sort of our naive first stab at how should we make use of digital networks in the knowledge work world, and that will evolve past it, the more sophisticated, more variegated type strategies. We're just simply in the early stage. 20, 30 years from now, we'll look back at the way we work today with the same sort of head-shaking incredulity that Henry Ford probably looked back at the way they were building cars before they figured out the assembly line.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I was in a discussion the other day with that. Will we look back 30 years from now and wonder what were we doing with social media back then? So that's interesting that you pulled that out here. Talking about deep work, I want to read verbatim the definition you have in the book because it's so good. I don't want to get it wrong. You say that deep work is professional activities performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that push your cognitive capabilities to their limit. But then you also define shallow work as logistical style tasks often performed while distracted. These efforts tend to not create much new value, I think that's key there, in the world and are easy to replicate. And so I wanted to ask you, does deep work lead someone to finding the work that they love? Or should people find what they love first and then devote themselves to deep work in that specific field? What's your outlook on that?
Well, it's a complicated question, and it's one I essentially wrote a whole book about. So Good They Can't Ignore You. The book I wrote before Deep Work was really the precursor to Deep Work, and it tackled this question of how do people end up really satisfied or passionate about their work. And the discovery I have is that for most people who end up really loving what they do for a living, they don't start with a strong pre-existing passion and then use that as the foundation of their career choices. That's largely mythology. It's also largely new mythology. We don't even have this notion that you should follow your passion. That doesn't even really arrive until the early 1990s as even an idea in our culture. So this idea that you are wired to do one thing, and if you match your work to that thing, that will then supply you motivation and interest and satisfaction that will just sort of drive your career in a satisfying way. That's largely not true. It's true for some people, but largely not a very replicatable pattern. What's more common is that as you build rare and valuable skills, your satisfaction, meaning, and passion derived from the job increase along with it. So it's an interesting reinforcing feedback loop. You take something maybe that's interesting, but you wouldn't call it your one true passion because such things don't typically exist. And you work hard on it. You get good at the core skills. That makes you even more interested in it. You like it even more. That motivates you to work even harder, to focus deeper, to build more skills. And you get this virtuous feedback cycle that 5-10 years later, you're world class. You're able to use those skills as leverage to shape your career in all sorts of interesting ways that makes it very satisfying. And you would say, oh, I'm very passionate about this. But that passion arose as part of the process of working deeply, building skills, using those skills as leverage on your behalf. It's rarely something that's actually fully formed in advance.
That's really good. You know, I heard about your first book, but I actually was introduced to your work through Deep Work because everybody I know recommended it to me and read it, and it really changed the way that I view deep work, and I need to read through your first book, it sounds like, because the idea of following your passion is such a big topic right now. Getting even further into the discussion of deep work, I wanted to ask you about the time devoted to deep work. You know, reading your book, it seems like you chunk off certain periods of time into deep work and then you focus on teaching. And it seems like Adam Grant might have used this same idea in his own life. But I wanted to ask you, how much time should we devote to deep work? Is it a idea of deep work being devoted every week, or are you looking at it at months of time chunked off? How does that work?
Well, there's the question of how much, and then there's the question of when to do it, and they're both relevant.
Right.
So the how much question, I think the week is the right unit of measure.
Okay.
The right time scale for thinking about how much deep work you should be doing. That is, you should be thinking in terms of how much deep work per week should I be doing. If you do it per day, that's not going to really work because days are too different. I mean, you can have a day where almost no time is going to be available for deep work and another day in that same week where a lot of time is available. And it's hard to avoid that type of variation. But if you're thinking about it on the scale of a month, it's too much time. Right. You're dealing the amounts of time you're dealing with are too large and amorphous. It's hard to get your arms around. It's hard for it to seem tractable or practical. Now, in terms of how much should you be doing per week? Well, it really depends on who you are and what you do.
Okay.
And so a standard exercise I recommend for people is whether you work for yourself or work for someone else, have this conversation. And so if you work for someone else, have it with your boss. If you work for yourself, have it with yourself, where you say, what is my ideal ratio of deep work hours to shallow work hours in the typical week? So out of the hours I work in a typical week, what ratio of those are deep work, the shallow work hours? That's a number that I think almost anyone in the knowledge economy should have. You should have that and have some confidence that this is a good number. This is what you're aiming for. Now, it's going to vary depending on what you do. I mean, a computer programmer is going to have a very different answer than, say, a customer service rep. Right. I mean, it depends what you do, but you should have the number. You should be managing for depth like you would any other tier one skill. Once you've decided this is what I want to do, this is the ratio I'm looking for, you need to measure and then adjust. So you measure, and if you're falling well short, say, well, what changes can I make to make sure that I hit the target that I decided with myself was good, or I decided with my boss was good. And that's where you can start getting into, well, maybe I need to take things off my plate, or I need smarter scheduling, or I need better heuristics about where I fit this work. It opens up a whole bunch of productivity and scheduling hacks. But in some sense, you don't want to get to those hacks until you've answered the big picture question of, this is what I'm aiming for when it comes to applying this particular skill in my typical work week.
I was going to ask you about that as far as people who are in their current work environment and don't feel like they can batch work to go deeper with their work. And it sounds like you're saying that they need to communicate with their boss and figure out what works for them. Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And this is what I've got a lot of positive feedback about this from readers from the book, that if you're in a work culture where it's very difficult to do deep work, let's say there's just certain sort of communication expectations, for example, that makes it hard for you to be sort of offline and focused hard. What doesn't work is if you complain.
Yeah.
You say, yeah,
Right.
you bother me too much. You guys, people send me too many emails. Like, I'm mad about it. And I'm going to do something different. That tends to be counterproductive. But this ratio approach is actually a positive approach, and people are reporting relatively amazing results. So you have this conversation, and it's all about, how can I maximize the value I produce for us? Right? I mean, here's what deep work is. Here's what shallow work is. Obviously, both are important. Obviously, you want me doing some deep work. Obviously, there's some shallow work that needs to be done. Someone has to file the papers that keeps the machinery running. Right? You need both. What's the ratio that's going to produce the most value? And you agree on it. Like, okay, we've hatched a plan together. Right? This is our strategy. We're going to try to hit 50%. This is going to make you very valuable to us. When you're working from that foundation, now it's much easier to build changes into the culture. And I get reports back from readers who tell me how they were convinced that the particular culture in their workplace was completely entrenched and would never change. They have this conversation. Within a day or two, massive changes are happening to the culture.
Wow.
I mean, a lot of these sort of workplace cultures surrounding, for example, communication expectations are much more arbitrary than we imagine. It's easy to think like this is someone decided this is the right way to work, but there's interesting research that captures how these things just emerge. No one really directs them. And the flip side of that is they're easy to manipulate. They're easy to mold if you have a particular trusted positive direction to shape that molding. And so this ratio thing works great because it's like, hey, we agreed on this because we think it's going to produce more value. I'm not hitting it. So either we were wrong that this is the right ratio to produce the most value for our organization, or we can make some changes to get more value. And so you're doing a positive thing. And now suddenly they say, great, like we now have, I'll give you just a concrete example. A reader who gave me their case study, he's a marketer for a Silicon Valley startup where he essentially writes white papers. So these are very demanding technical things, but you have to have these pretty sophisticated white papers for a lot of these tech products that are business to business. It's a core piece of the marketing. But they had the Slack culture at his company, where if you didn't respond to your Slack channels that you were monitoring, you ironically were considered slacking off. So they're paying him a lot of money, right? And he's like, it's not there was nothing important being done on those Slack channels, but he taken him forever to write these reports. So he sat down with his boss and he told her, he'd read the book, said, okay, here's what deep work is, here's what shallow work is. I mean, what should the ratio be? And he said, as soon as he had started the conversation with her, it became crystal clear in the room that it would be ridiculous for his boss to say, I want you doing 0 hours of deep work. So they were paying him a lot of money to produce these things that the more deep work lets you do it faster, lets you do it better. And it just kind of, it brought in the focus. So they said, well, honestly, I think 50-50 is what we should be aiming for. Like you should be doing about 50% of your time deep work and the other 50, the other logistics that surround it. And so he said, okay, well, how's that going to happen? Like this is very difficult to hit that because again, deep work doesn't count if you look at your Slack channel in the middle of a deep work hour, it doesn't count as deep work, right? I mean, you got to be very rigorous. You cannot have context switched. If you context switch, it doesn't count as deep work. So how's this going to work? And she thought about it and said, well, here's what we're going to do. So she went and talked to his team and said, okay, here's the deal. There's these 2 hours in the morning and these 2 hours in the afternoon every day. This is when he's doing his deep work. He can't be reached, right? I mean, just don't expect it. I'm the boss. I'm the CEO. I'm telling you, don't expect it. This is what I want.
Right.
And he said it took like 3 or 4 days. And they forgot at first, and then it took them 3 or 4 days to adjust. Like, oh yeah, if I need something from him, like make sure I got to grab him before his deep work set. And it's very predictable. They knew when it was. They knew there was buy-in. It took them a few days to adjust. Okay, I can't talk to him during these 2 hours, so let me make sure to talk to him right before if there's something urgent. And he's doing 50% of his time is unbroken depth right now. It makes him massively more valuable. And he thought those type of changes would have been impossible But coming in with this positive, let's talk about the ratio, let's agree on something together, and then let's see what we can do to make it work, did wonders.
And I really appreciate the case studies you presented in the book, but you also presented your own life and how it had helped you write academic papers, your books. I mean, how long did it take you to write Deep Work? I'm just curious.
Uh, yeah, well, it's a the actual for me the actual at the keyboard writing a book is 6 to 12 months. Though there's usually a couple years of thinking and writing that goes before actually starting work on a book manuscript. So that took place in throughout about an academic year. I wrote that. But but I gotta say, this experience I had, like when I was writing Deep Work during that academic year, what the story I tell in the book is that my academic productivity should have gone down because I was spending a lot more time writing a book. But because the book was about deep work, I was, for obvious reasons, getting a little bit more serious about tuning up my deep work habits because every day I was thinking a lot about this.
Sure.
And during that period when I was writing the book, I published a factor of 2 more peer-reviewed papers than any other year previous.
Wow.
As an academic. And that is what I try to emphasize, is that when I emphasize doing the hard work of training your ability to focus and then rebuilding your working life to center on deep concentrated work, it's not about small wins. It's not about being a little bit more productive. It's not about being a little bit less distracted. It's instead about factor of 2 improvements in your productivity. Actually, there's 2x. That 2x thing, it came up in several different places when I was doing this research, where people are doing 2x valuable output as compared to their peers when they started really emphasizing deep work. I mean, I think I have a quote in there where Eric Barker calls it like a superpower. Like if you're actually embracing the deep life, it's not this sort of nibbling around the edges. It's massively more productive. And I think that's part of the reason why the book is spreading, is that when people actually embrace these ideas, it's night and day. And, I mean, it's hard work, but it's, wow, I am now phenomenally more productive than I used to be. And my boss is wondering what's going on.
Yeah.
It's that type of.
And I mean, you've talked about the Slack, but where I've seen it in my own life is the constant social media check. And that, it convicted me, and that's changed in my own life. But I mean, what would you say about social media? You've dove into the Slack work environment, but what about our personal lives, social media? Where have you seen it a benefit to cut it out? How often would you say people should be checking it? Is it based on what people do again? What does that look like?
Yeah, some of it depends, right? I mean, there's my personal view on social media where I don't use it. I've never have it. I think it's completely overhyped. I think many fewer people should be using it. Not a lot of people agree with me on that. So then there's my pragmatic suggestions. And the huge dividing line here is whether you're talking about using social media for your business or not. So if you have a business and you're using social media to help market the business, I mean, all the more power to you. I think it's a great thing to market on, because despite my best efforts, everyone uses it, and it gives you a very targeted way of reaching people. So I don't begrudge people using social media in their business, but I would suggest that if you do, you use it like a professional. There's no reason for a business person to have social media on their phone.
Okay.
The only reason for social media to exist on your phone is because it allowed the social media companies to 4 or 5 times increase the number of minutes they got their average user to spend on the service. It's all about the stock price for these companies. There's absolutely no benefit to accessing on your phone. So if you have a social media plan you use for promoting your business, it's fine. You schedule it like anything else. You do it on your computer certain times a week. It's barely a footprint in your life. I actually recommend people do the same thing in your personal life. I mean, if you're scared about leaving certain social media platforms, take it off your phone. Again, there's no reason for this to be on your phone except for if you own stock in these companies and you want to see their revenue going up, right? I mean,
Right.
The phone apps are engineered to be as addictive as possible because you have your phone with you at all times. So if they can make those massively addictive, you'll look at it all the time. They can get these huge user hours. So my suggestion is, don't have it on your phone. Use it on your computer. Use it for specific purposes. If there's 2 or 3 things like this is very valuable, I get this off social media, do it on your computer. In my experience, most people can get 90% of the value they get out of social media in about 2 sessions of 20 minutes each once a week.
Okay.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't actually like, I need to check in on my friends. I need to look at this. I look at this particular feed. Yeah, you log in Wednesday night, you log in Sunday night, 20 minutes on your desktop. You've gotten the value, and you've not seeded massive amounts of your time and attention over to the social media companies. And so, that's how I break it down. So just whoever you are, don't have it on your phone. Use it with a purpose. If you can't think of a good purpose, then stop using it. It's okay. Nothing bad happens. And if you're, especially if you're a business, treat it like a professional. Don't let the fact that you use it to market as a business trick you into being, 60 to 70 minutes a day of checks on your phone. That's not business. That's just being a product in the social media marketing machine. That's just giving them more time and attention to be packaged up. Like, you don't want to be the thing they're selling. You want to be using them to help sell your thing. And those are two different types of activities.
That's really good. That gives me something to think about. So thank you. I mean, is your thoughts around email kind of the same, or is it different? Then, should we have it on our phones? How often do you check your email? What would you say on email?
I mean, the issue with email, I don't have anything against the tool itself. It's just the tool itself is just supernatural. It's asynchronous message passing. Like, of course, we're going to have that if we have digital networks. I care about the work cultures surrounding email, right?
Okay.
So when I talk about, hey, there's problems with the way we're working, all the email checking, for example, often people's reaction, which I think is the wrong reaction, is, well, what technology should we use instead of email? But the problem is not the technology, right? It has nothing to do with the technology. It's the work culture. It's like, if your work culture depends on back and forth messaging all day to sort of figure things out, then, whatever messaging technology you'll use,
Right.
you're going to be sending messages all day, right? It's not about the technology. It's about the work culture. So email is a complicated one,
Yeah.
right? And I think for a company that's really dependent on the hyperactive hive mind workflow, they don't have other systems or processes. It needs this ongoing conversation going on just for things to make progress during the day. If you try to come in there and say, well, now we're going to try to reduce email, we're going to have email free Fridays, or we're going to stop using emails in the evening, or whatever it is, it actually hurts the company. I mean, if the company depends on unstructured back and forth communication, the function, if that is the main mechanism in which information passes, decisions are made, then without it, it suffers. And that's why I think a lot of these initiatives to try to tame email around the edges end up failing, because it actually just makes the company work worse. And so, I mean, there's little things you can do as an individual that might make things better. I think the bigger picture solution is going to be, we have to change the way we work.
Yeah.
How do we run our
That's good.
organization? Yeah.
And I'm just letting you talk because you are such a rare voice in this social media driven environment we're all in. And I just love to hear what you have to say, because it is so different from what everybody else is saying. But I want to pull back a little bit, because we've been really practical in our own lives, but I want to go more big picture. And us as leaders, I want to talk about accountability, right? Because we're talking about ourselves here, but what about our employees and allowing them to do deep work? Where does accountability fit into the picture then? If you're saying that, we're not needing to message all day every day and allowing them to put in deep work, and maybe cutting back on emails, what does that look like? Is it more effective meetings at a certain time of the day? What do you think on that?
I mean, so you're asking, like, what does it look like to manage for deep work? I mean, if you're not constantly,
Yeah.
if you have people who are actually away thinking hard and not constantly within a communication net, you're saying, how does that even, how do you run an organization? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's complicated, and it
Right.
probably it's hard, and it differs from company to company. I'm working on a book now that gets into this more.
Okay. Can't wait
And
to
I'm
read
trying to,
it.
yeah, it looks at, I'm finding some of these examples of companies that I say practice email freedom, which has little to do with the technology and more to do with the workflow. It's companies where unstructured, unscheduled messaging plays a minor role.
Okay.
Right. So
Yeah.
like your inbox or Slack channel does not play a huge role. Like, things unfold without requiring lots of just sort of, oh, I'm going to send a message to you that you weren't expecting, wasn't pre-scheduled, not part of some system, just unscheduled messaging. And the reality is, it's difficult and inconvenient. And so an inconvenience, I think, is the big point here, because we tend to overvalue it in the absence of other metrics. So managers, often an issue they'll have is, I want to avoid bad things happening or inconvenient things happening for me. right? I mean, there could be a scenario where I need you and I can't reach you. That would be bad. Or maybe we can't get you on the phone here and it hurts like our relationship with a client or something like that. It would be inconvenient. It would be hard. But the reality is about business is that, often the best way to produce things is really inconvenient and annoying and not at all the easiest way to do it, and has hard edges and can cause problems. And I like to point out the example of like how inconvenient the assembly line is. It is a gigantic pain
Yeah.
to try to run an assembly line versus the old way of building cars was so much more convenient for everyone involved. You had, here's a team of people that's going to build a car right here. And there's another team of people who's going to build a car in place right here. And then there was just sort of, here's where all the tires are, here's where all the screws are. And you sort of sit there with your team and you work and build a car. It's like how people build things. It's incredibly natural. You go at your own pace. If someone's slow, it's fine. Like it works. The assembly line was a huge pain, right? I mean, you have to think about the assembly line. Like you have to, if everything's not timed up just right, like if someone starts going too slow, like the whole line can stop and it stops everyone else's progress. You have to have all these new contraptions and machinery. It takes you need more actually, you have to spend more on overhead and management just to try to keep these things working properly. Like it's a gigantic pain. I mean, if you would never do it voluntarily, except for it produces 10x more cars per day than the old method. And
Right.
so I like to give that example when you're thinking about building a work culture that prioritizes concentration, the sort of using focused concentration to use your brain to produce value, the primary mode in which value is created in knowledge work. If you're going to build your business back around it, you're going to have systems and processes that support it, and they're going to be more complicated and more inconvenient than simply just having everyone monitor a Slack channel or be in their inbox. It's going to be a pain, and some bad things are going to happen. But what you're looking for is not avoiding bad things or inconvenience. You're looking for the 10x improvement in the number of cars produced off the assembly line. And I think there's huge opportunity for that right now. Don't worry so much about is this inconvenient or could something bad might happen. Instead, think my main capital investment in knowledge work is human brains. The main way in which value is produced in knowledge work is a brain thinking hard about something and producing new information that has value. How do I get these brains to produce as much as that as possible? And we'll figure out the inconveniences another time. Like work is inconvenient. It's a pain. It's supposed to be a pain. We'll figure it out. Do we have to hire some more people? Do we need to build a new system? Whatever we got to do. But these brains, right? This is our assembly line. These are our oil derricks, right? How do we get the oil derricks to pump the most oil out of the ground, even if that requires, more complex machinery around it? And so I really push back. It's going to be inconvenient. It's going to be a pain, but who cares? That's not the point.
That's getting us to think so much more long term than short term, and that's really good. That minor inconvenience in the moment will produce better in the long run. Talking about assembly lines, it reminds me that you mentioned flow in the book, and it's a word that I've read in other books. How would you define flow? And then how can deep work generate that flow state?
Right. Well, so flow is a concept that it was Csikszentmihalyi, might be saying that slightly wrong, but it's a psychologist who came up with the concept, and he would say he discovered the concept as something that exists, and it's a psychological state that people fall into when typically they're doing some sort of skilled activity. So like an athlete in the middle of a game, so a downhill skier going down doing the high-speed ski run or whatever, you enter into the state where you sort of lose track of time, you're completely engaged in it. And this is considered to be it's a very pleasurable state. People really enjoy it. It's a very satisfying type state. Artists get into it, athletes get into it, writers get into it. And so it's a positive thing where you're locked in. You're locked into what you're doing. You lose track of time. It's all encompassing. Flow's relationship to deep work is that it's one type of deep work, right? So if you're in a flow state, you're doing deep work. There's other things you could be doing that are not a flow state that are also deep work. So it's not synonymous. It is a flavor of deep work. But one of the reasons why people who focus on deep work tend to be more satisfied with their working lives is that they enter these flow states much more often than someone who doesn't prioritize it. And the flow states feel great, and they're very satisfying and very meaningful. And so flow is one of the reasons why serious deep workers tend to be much more satisfied with their working lives.
Gotcha. I just heard that word a lot and was wondering where that fit in, so that makes sense. I also wanted to ask you about collaboration. So, we're working alongside other people. A lot of the deep work you talk about seems to focus on being solo, by ourselves, putting in deep work. But is it possible to do deep work with other people? How does that work?
Yeah, nothing about deep work requires you to be alone. In
Okay.
fact, as it's sort of well known in sort of academic circles, where well among theoreticians in particular, so people like me who solve math proofs, small groups working together often induce more depth than an individual working alone. And so we call it, sort of in my field, we call it the whiteboard effect. So if there's three of you standing at a whiteboard trying to solve a problem, you're going to concentrate better than if it was just you alone thinking about it. And that's in part just because of the social pressure of the situation. Like if three smart people, you're working on the problem together, one of you is at the whiteboard. If you let your attention wander, you're going to lose the train of discussion. And then you're going to have to say, wait, stop, I lost it. Go back, right? I mean, it's a little bit embarrassing or it's a little bit annoying or whatever. So actually, the social pressures of working with a small group of people on the same problem can extract much more, we call it concentrative energy, than just an individual working by themselves. And so, I mean, I like the idea of working with other people. I mean, the situation, of course, has to be you're doing something skilled. Everyone shares the skills. You're all applying your skills together to try to make progress on the problem. I think it's like a booster shot for deep work, and it's something that I'm actually pretty encouraging of.
No, that's really helpful too for people who work on teams and for leaders who have teams who want to incorporate deep work into their work environment. All of this is really challenging for myself. I'm sure it is for listeners as well. Kind of wrapping up here, the idea for me as I read this book was that you want people to find what they want to do, find what is important to them, and then to set up their life in a way to support those goals. Is that what you're wanting people to do first? Going back to our earlier conversation, saying that book was maybe a precursor to this one.
Yeah.
Do you think people should find what's important to them first and then put deep work into that?
I would say the way I would say it would be pick something that's important to you from among potentially a large set of different things that are important to you. Just pick one of them, and then use deep work. Work deeply on that to get as good as possible, to build as much skills, to produce as much value as possible, and that will lead to good things. One of the core things I try to emphasize in my book 2 books ago is that you need to get away from the mindset that there's one thing you're meant to do. When you put too much emphasis on the choice that there's a single career or a single endeavor that will give you satisfaction and everything else won't, it's a nearly impossible psychological situation, because it means every hardship, every boring month, everything is going to get you wondering, oh, maybe this is a signal I chose the wrong thing. This is not the one thing. To me, the choice is much less important. It's not irrelevant. I mean, you can't just throw a dart at a job listing and say, great, I guess I'm going to be a gymnast or something. But
Sure.
But on the other hand, most people, it's pretty clear, like, here's a collection of things that are sort of well suited for my personality and existing skills, and which I think could produce really interesting options for me if I got good at it. Most people have a set of things like that they can come up with. Any of those is a fine foundation for building a meaningful life. What matters is what you do once you make the choice. And so in So Good They Can't Ignore You, I said, once you choose something, you have to get really good at it and produce value. That's going to give you this leverage. I called it career capital. And that's what's going to allow you to shape your career in a way that is meaningful. And so the feedback to So Good They Can't Ignore You was, okay, so if I buy that, how do I do that? How do I get really good at something once I choose it and produce, lots of valuable things? And so the answer to that was, well, you need to do deep work. So deep work was a natural follow-up to So Good They Can't Ignore You. It's the sort of how that corresponds to the why from So Good They, or the what, I should say, from So Good They Can't Ignore You. So Good They Can't Ignore You is like, here's what you should do if you want to build a meaningful work life. Deep work operationalizes that. If you're in knowledge work or craft, almost certainly building up skill, producing value is going to be very well served by your ability to do deep concentration.
That's so good. It looks like you're taking us on a journey then with the book you mentioned that you're writing right now. So that's great.
Yeah.
You've said so much today, so much value, Cal. I've taken some away for myself. I know listeners have as well. So this question I try to ask every guest. So it could be something you've already said that you just want to highlight. Could be a new idea that you haven't mentioned yet. But what's one last piece of advice that you'd like to leave listeners with today?
So I think a theme that goes through a lot of my writing is this notion of minimalism, which is Focusing on a small number of things that are very valuable and doing them really well produces more total value in your life than trying to also squeeze in lots of other little things that also bring in a little bit of value. That by focusing on a small number of things to the exclusion of everything else, so basically missing out on all the other little things, is a recipe for a better life than trying to grab or pursue or be involved in every last little thing that might produce some types of value. I used to have a headline on my blog back when I was focused mainly on students that said, do less, but do better. And that was sort of a theme that I've been pushing for a long time. Do less things, do those things better. Don't worry about all the little things you're missing out on that might be valuable. You don't build a meaningful life or start an empire off of the sort of aggregation of lots of little small things. That this social media hit here, this little networking thing here. It's the big, focused, I did this thing. It's important. I'm good at it. That's what makes things happen. So do less, but do better. If you're applying that philosophy in almost any part of your life, it's going to be successful.
You said, you've had that kind of mantra for a really long time. Do you think there's a secret to holding on to one thing for so long? And it almost seems like you've built your whole work around that, your life around that, where so many people will pick and choose one thing for maybe a year and then grab something else. Do you think there's something to that? Because it almost seems like you've known that from early on, and your entire life's work so far has been built around that idea. I found that really interesting.
Well, it's a core idea. You study people who do interesting, important things. It's almost always they're coming from a mindset of focusing on a small number of things to the exclusion of lots of other things and doing them really well. I mean, if you think about the people you admire, no one ever really admires the hey, this guy was such a social media guru. He mastered every new platform and was on there, crushing it on here and that. What you admire is Elon Musk was I'm going to figure out how to build a rocket. We're going to build a rocket. I'm just going to do this. I could do it for a decade and make it work. Or you're okay, yeah, that's interesting. Or Steve Jobs, we're going to make this new type of personal computer better. We're going to make computers better. I'm maniacal about it. We admire craft, we admire expertise, we admire someone who's really good at something. And you see that theme so often. And, Steve Martin in his Born Standing Up memoir, somewhere in there, I remember him saying, it stuck with me, that sort of the key to his success in comedy and the banjo was diligence. And he says, the hard thing about diligence is it's not just about keep working on the same thing. It's about persistently saying no to everything else. And that's the thing that trips people up, is that it's really hard to say, no, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to, I'm just going to put that time to practicing harder. I want to get better. And so it's really difficult, but I really think it's a great formula. And it's not as scary as it seems when you start out, because remember, as you get better at something, it's going to produce more value in your life, which is going to make you more motivated to get even better. You're going to get this virtuous feedback cycle. So you do not have to have the entire reservoir of passion and motivation you need to master something in advance. That reservoir will keep filling as you get better. It's a self-reinforcing loop. So I really try to make it seem less intimidating. It's not I have 10 years worth of fire in me for this thing. It's I have enough fire to try this for 6 months to see if I can get better. And then I'll hope that bootstraps the next 6 months.
That's really good advice. And learning to say no, that's something that I am constantly working on, because I am a recovering people pleaser. So it's a good reminder. Last question for you, Cal. Where would you like to send people to find out more about you and your work?
Right. Well, as I mentioned, you're not going to find me on social media because I've never had a social media account, which it turns out is allowed. But I'm a big blogger. And so if you go to calnewport.com, I've been blogging there for over a decade. And so it's a nice way to sort of engage with some of the things I think about. And then you can, of course, find my books there, Amazon, or anywhere else that books are sold.
Awesome. Cal, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you got something out of these ideas. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode.